The morning they found the Dalton children, the woods were unnaturally quiet, as if Pine Hollow itself had paused to listen. Mist clung to the pines like damp breath, and the search party moved with a dread they pretended was just exhaustion. The children were discovered sitting in a small clearing miles from any marked trail, their clothes soaked with dew, their skin pale, their eyes fixed on something the adults couldn't see. None of them cried. None of them spoke. They simply stared, unblinking, as though the forest had taught them to be afraid of their own voices. By the time Sheriff Grayson carried the youngest child out of the trees, a strange heaviness settled over the rescue team, a pressure in the air that made their thoughts feel slow and their hands unsteady. Paramedics whispered that the children had been gone too long to be standing on their own feet. A doctor swore she saw one of them flinch at a shadow that wasn't there. And as the sun rose over Pine Hollow, the townspeople gathered outside the clinic, wearing the same expression, relief mixed with something darker, something they didn't want to name. Old residents muttered that the woods had given something back, but their trembling voices suggested this was not a blessing. That afternoon, when Sheriff Grayson returned to the clearing, he found a symbol carved deep into the bark of a dying oak, a perfect circle, split by a jagged line down the center. He touched it only once before stepping away, heart hammering, because the mark felt warm, as if it had been carved moments before, not days or years. No one knew where the children had been for the 3 missing weeks. But the more the town watched them, the way their eyes darted toward dark corners, the way they flinched at the sound of wind moving through branches, the more Pine Hollow remembered the stories it had tried to bury, the warnings whispered by those who died too old to forget. And though no one dared say it aloud, a quiet fear began to spread. The Dalton children weren't just found. The discovery of the Dalton children in the summer of 1979 became the kind of moment that settled into Pine Hollow like a stain, something that refused to wash away no matter how many times the town tried to forget it. For 3 weeks, the entire region had searched for the missing siblings, combing through winding trails, abandoned barns, drainage ditches, and every brittle corner of the dense Pine Hollow woods. Volunteers dragged flashlights through the dark, calling their names until their voices cracked, but the forest swallowed all sound and returned nothing. Hope began to shrink with each passing day, and even the Dalton parents, once fiercely certain their children would be found alive, had started whispering prayers that sounded more like apologies. Then, on a humid morning thick with fog, a search party stumbled upon a clearing no one remembered seeing before, a place where the trees leaned in tightly, as though guarding something fragile and forbidden. There, sitting in a line on the damp earth, were the Dalton children. Their clothes clung to their bodies with morning dew, their hair matted, their bare feet pressed into the soil as if rooted in place. They did not look up when the searchers approached. They did not flinch when the rustle of boots broke through the silence. They simply sat, perfectly still, hands resting limply in their laps, eyes fixed on a patch of trees opposite them, watching something the adults could not see. The oldest child had a faint scratch along his cheek, but otherwise they appeared physically unharmed. That detail unsettled the rescuers more than if they had been bruised or injured. The children looked as though they had stepped out of their home only moments before, despite being missing for 22 days. When the searchers tried to speak to them, the children showed no recognition. Their expressions did not shift. Their lips did not twitch. Their eyes, wide and glassy, held a kind of emptiness that made grown men step back without understanding why. A seasoned deputy whispered that he felt as though the children had brought the forest's silence back with them, carrying it like a shroud. Even after they were lifted into waiting arms, they resisted nothing and offered nothing. Their small bodies were limp, compliant, yet their gaze never left the trees. One witness later claimed he felt watched the entire time, as if something stood just beyond the clearing's edge, hidden behind bark and shadow. By the time they reached town, a strange heaviness followed them, a feeling that Pine Hollow had unknowingly crossed a threshold the moment those children were found, and that whatever they had seen in those woods had not stayed behind. From the moment the Dalton children were brought into Pine Hollow's small medical clinic, it became clear that whatever had happened to them in the woods had gone far beyond physical harm. Doctors and nurses expected dehydration, exhaustion, maybe some bruising or insect bites. What they did not expect was the profound stillness that clung to each child, a silence so thick it unsettled even the most experienced staff. The medical team spoke to them gently, asked simple questions, offered water and soft blankets, but the children reacted as if voices were nothing more than distant echoes drifting past them. Their eyes remained unfocused, tracking invisible movements across ceilings, corners, and doorways, as though they were watching something move that no one else could see. It wasn't the silence itself that frightened the adults, it was the way the children's breathing shifted whenever a shadow passed, the way their pupils dilated at the slightest flicker of motion. One nurse tried to take the youngest child's hand, and though he didn't pull away, his small fingers trembled violently, as if the touch forced him to remember something he was trying desperately to forget. Another doctor reported that the middle child flinched at the sound of rustling paper, her gaze fixed on an empty corner of the room with such terror that the doctor swore he felt someone standing there. Yet each time they were asked what they had seen, where they had been, or who had taken them, their lips remained sealed. They did not cry, did not blink away tears, did not attempt to communicate in any manner. It was as if the ability to speak had been stripped from them, not through trauma alone, but through a kind of learned fear, something carved into them deeper than any wound could go. At night, the clinic staff heard faint noises from their room, not words, not cries, but a strange rhythmic breathing, like the children were trying to match the sound of something only they could hear. Occasionally, one of them would sit upright in their bed, eyes sharp and alert, staring toward the window even when the blinds were drawn shut. The youngest child was found once standing barefoot on the cold floor, his face pressed to the wall, listening intently to something on the other side as though someone whispered directly into the plaster. When questioned, he slid back under the covers without expression, but his eyes flicked to the dark corners with a fear that made the nurse check the room twice before leaving. The town had prayed for the children to return alive, but no one had imagined that their voices might never return with them, and in that heavy, suffocating silence, Pine Hollow sensed that the forest had not simply hidden them, it had taught them to fear speaking about what waited there. Sheriff Grayson had walked the perimeter of the clearing dozens of times since the Dalton children were found, but something about that place kept drawing him back, a magnetic pull he could neither name nor resist. The trees leaned inward, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers, casting shadows that seemed to twitch when he wasn't looking directly at them. It was during one of these late afternoon inspections that he noticed it, a strange symbol carved deep into the trunk of a gnarled oak at the clearing's edge. The lines were clean, deliberate, and unnervingly precise, a circle split in two by a jagged slash that seemed almost to pulse when the sun hit it at certain angles. Grayson knelt to inspect it, brushing away moss and dirt, and an inexplicable chill ran down his spine. He had seen carvings before, initials, dates, gang symbols, the occasional crude doodle. But nothing resembled this. Nothing held the same weight of intent, the same sense that it had been left there not just to mark a place, but to send a message. As he traced the edges with his fingers, memories from his childhood began to surface, vague, shadowy recollections of old men warning in hushed tones never to wander too far into Pine Hollow's woods, of strange gatherings where flames licked the night sky and chants echoed through the trees. He had dismissed them as stories meant to scare children, yet now the symbol made those whispers tangible, as though the forest itself had preserved a language he had never learned. Grayson returned to town that evening, carrying the weight of what he had seen like a stone in his chest. He showed the carving to a few older residents, hoping for insight, but their reactions were immediate and strange. They refused to discuss it, their hands shaking, voices low, eyes darting to the woods as if they expected something or someone to be listening. One man muttered that it was the mark of what the town buried long ago, and then, as though realizing he had said too much, fell silent, retreating into his house without another word. The sheriff couldn't ignore it. That night, he lay awake, the symbol burned into his mind, and for the first time, he felt the weight of Pine Hollow's hidden history pressing down on him. The forest, the children, the carved tree, they were connected in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Something ancient and deliberate had left its trace, a warning or a claim, and Grayson knew instinctively that the moment the children were found was only the beginning. The symbol, carved into the oak with a precision that suggested both patience and obsession, whispered of secrets that the town had spent decades hiding, secrets that were now clawing their way back to the surface, demanding to be seen, understood, and feared. Whispers began to thread their way through Pine Hollow not long after the symbol was discovered, quiet murmurs that grew louder with every retelling, until even those who had spent years pretending nothing existed in the woods could no longer ignore them. The townspeople spoke of a tradition long buried, a series of rituals tied to the earliest families who had settled Pine Hollow generations before. Most dismissed it as superstition, stories meant to frighten children or entertain idle listeners at the local diner, but the timing of the Dalton children's disappearance made those tales feel less like legend and more like a warning freshly unearthed. Older residents who remembered the stories in hushed tones now spoke with a rigidity that suggested fear rather than nostalgia, recounting gatherings at the edge of the forest where chants had been raised, fires lit, and offerings made to something unseen. The forest had once been the stage for these ceremonies, a place where the town's founders sought to appease whatever lingered in the shadowed heart of Pine Hollow. According to the few who dared admit the truth, the rituals had stopped decades earlier, abandoned after a tragedy so great it was only ever referenced obliquely, as if the forest had punished the town for remembering. The resurfacing of these old practices unsettled the town in ways that the children themselves could not. Adults who had once mocked the idea of ancestral pacts or forest spirits found themselves scanning the tree line at night, certain that some unseen presence was observing, waiting, measuring their compliance or their ignorance. Rumors suggested that the Dalton family had long been tied to these events, their bloodline marked for roles they had never been told about, generations steeped in obligations that had been quietly forgotten until now. The clearing where the children were found, the symbol etched into the oak, and the children themselves were all interpreted as signs that whatever had been dormant was stirring once more. Townsfolk remembered that the forest had a rhythm, a memory, and that the past could be recalled with a single misstep, a single forgotten gesture. Stories of missing children, strange lights, and faint chants that faded with the wind became topics of hushed conversation in grocery stores and barbershops, each retelling carrying more weight, more urgency, more dread. As the whispers spread, even the town's youth began noticing patterns adults could not explain: the repetition of symbols, the odd positioning of trees in the clearing, the way animals avoided certain paths in the woods. It was as though the forest itself had codified the memory of the rituals into the land, insisting that those who were attuned might perceive the old ways being reawakened. The sense of unease deepened, threading through every street, every home, every glance toward the edge of the trees. And for the first time in decades, Pine Hollow felt smaller, more confined, as though the past was pressing in from all sides, demanding acknowledgement before it could rest again. As the days passed after their rescue, the Dalton children remained largely silent, yet one small behavior began to draw attention in a way that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The youngest of the siblings, no older than 7, had started to carry scraps of paper and a stub of pencil everywhere, sitting quietly in corners of the clinic or on the edge of the Dalton farmhouse porch, and drawing obsessively. At first, the images seemed like the innocent scrawlings of a child attempting to make sense of a world he had temporarily lost. Trees, sticks, and winding paths filled the pages, arranged with a meticulousness that suggested a mind attempting to map a territory only he understood. But soon, the content of his drawings became darker, more precise, and impossible to ignore. He sketched tall figures, impossibly thin and featureless, standing just behind trees or peering from shadows, their limbs twisted in ways that no human body could replicate. In each sketch, the figures seemed to watch the children, or perhaps to watch through them, their blank faces rendered with a cold detachment that unnerved every adult who glimpsed the pages. The older siblings remained reticent, but the youngest child's drawings appeared to capture something that had occurred in the woods during those missing weeks. Each night, he would huddle on the floor, pencil flying over paper, his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration, creating images that grew steadily more complex. He drew sequences of the clearing, the symbol carved into the tree, even shapes that seemed to hover in the periphery of vision. Attempts to question him about the meaning of the drawings were met with a flat stare, yet when adults or neighbors leaned in too close to study the sketches, he would suddenly begin to shake violently, as though the act of explanation might summon something he desperately wanted to avoid. The tension was almost tangible. Those who observed him swore the air in the room grew colder, heavier, as though the figures on the page carried a presence beyond ink and paper. Some began to speculate that the child's art was a form of communication, a silent attempt to convey horrors that could not be spoken aloud. Psychologists suggested he was processing trauma, that the sketches were merely a way to externalize fear. But the precision of the drawings, the recurrence of the same faceless figures, the eerie consistency of the forest layouts all suggested something far older, far more deliberate than mere childhood coping mechanisms. The townspeople who glimpsed the pages exchanged worried glances, the unease spreading through Pine Hollow like a whispering wind. It became clear that whatever had happened to the Dalton children in those weeks lost to the forest had left an imprint, one that the youngest sibling was now translating into a language the town could barely begin to understand. The drawings were warnings, memories, or perhaps something else entirely, but they carried the unmistakable weight of a secret the woods had withheld until that very moment, demanding attention through the unassuming hand of a child who had seen far too much. Not long after the youngest Dalton began producing his unnerving drawings, residents of Pine Hollow started noticing changes in the forest that had long been ignored. It began subtly at first, a low, rhythmic murmur drifting through the trees after midnight, so faint that it could be mistaken for wind brushing against the branches or the distant hum of a night insect. But those who listened closely knew it was something else entirely, a cadence too deliberate to be natural, a sound that seemed to pulse with a hidden purpose. Dogs barked incessantly at the edge of the woods, cats refused to enter yards that bordered the forest, and even the most skeptical neighbors admitted to lying awake, straining to catch the whispering, their hearts hammering in sudden terror. These were not ordinary sounds of the night, the townsfolk realized, but echoes of something ancient, something that had not been heard since the earliest settlers of Pine Hollow had passed into memory. The whispers grew in intensity with each passing night, weaving a slow, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to seep into homes through cracked windows and half-open doors. Children who had previously ignored the forest began speaking of hearing voices calling their names, while adults reported an oppressive feeling of being observed, a prickling sensation along the back of their necks that persisted long after they had returned inside. Some ventured to the edge of the clearing to investigate, only to be greeted by an unnatural stillness, a hush that swallowed sound entirely, followed by the faint, distant hum returning as soon as they retreated. It was as if the forest had learned to manipulate the senses, to tease and measure, to test those who dared to intrude on its boundaries. Old-timers began murmuring in secret, recalling tales from decades past about the night whispers that had always marked times of upheaval in the town. According to their memories, the phenomenon had vanished after the deaths of certain founding families, though details were murky, obscured by fear and shame. Now, after the Dalton children's return, the sounds had reawakened, sweeping through the forest in a deliberate, measured pattern that could not be ignored. People who had dismissed the stories as superstition now found themselves too frightened to remain outside after sunset. Even those who prided themselves on rational thinking felt the invisible weight of something watching, waiting, and responding to their every move. The atmosphere of Pine Hollow shifted. The air itself seemed charged, thickened by anticipation or warning, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Conversations in homes dwindled as families spoke less, listening for the subtle cadence drifting from the woods, the rhythmic whispering that now defined the nights. It was a sound that suggested intention, something that had been dormant for decades but had now returned with purpose, reaching out into the town to claim attention, to draw notice, to remind everyone that the forest had its memory, its rules, and that the Dalton children had somehow unlocked them again. As the nights stretched on in Pine Hollow, the unsettling presence in the woods began manifesting in more tangible ways, and the town could no longer ignore the warning signs. Animals, once common near the Dalton property, started disappearing without explanation. Dogs vanished from fenced yards, cats failed to return after dark, and livestock near the edges of the forest were found blooded or simply missing. The local farmers whispered that the woods had always had a hunger, a notion dismissed for generations, but now the pattern was undeniable. The disappearances coincided with the strange whispers and the heightened unease among the townsfolk, creating an atmosphere heavy with dread and suspicion. Each missing creature added weight to the fear that whatever had claimed the Dalton children, or at least marked them, was still active, and it was not constrained to the past. The most alarming discovery came when curiosity, or perhaps desperation, led a few brave or foolish townspeople to the Dalton farmhouse itself. The property had always carried a certain eerie reputation, with its peeling paint, shuttered windows, and the hollow creak of floorboards underfoot. Beneath the old structure, behind a trapdoor long sealed by boards and dust, they found a cellar whose air was thick, damp, and pungent with decay. It smelled of earth and rot, a smell that seemed to pulse and cling to the skin long after leaving. The cellar had clearly not been entered in decades, yet something within it suggested recent activity. Objects were displaced in ways that implied movement, as if something or someone had been navigating the cramped space in deliberate patterns. Deep scratches marred the walls, etched in a pattern that vaguely mirrored the symbol found on the oak in the forest clearing. When the Dalton children were asked about the cellar, they responded with silence, eyes wide and unblinking. The youngest occasionally shivered when near the doorway, whispering words that sounded like fragments of chants or warnings muttered to himself, though adults could make no sense of them. The forest, the clearing, the symbol, the whispers, and now the sealed cellar all connected in ways that defied reason. Even the most skeptical townspeople began avoiding the property, speaking in hushed tones about the unnatural alignment of events. The disappearances of animals, the pungent odor of the locked cellar, the faint sounds of movement beneath the floorboards, and the children's unspoken fear coalesced into a sense that something long hidden had been disturbed, something patient and deliberate that had not finished claiming what it believed was owed. Each night, the tension grew, pressing upon Pine Hollow like a weight that could not be lifted, leaving the community trapped in anticipation, unsure of whether the threat was imminent or already subtly weaving its influence through every street and home. The cellar became both a literal and symbolic heart of unease, a reminder that the past had not been left behind, and that the Dalton children had not yet returned alone. As the unnerving events surrounding the Dalton children continued to unfold, Pine Hollow's town council found itself gripped by a tension it could no longer ignore. What had once been a sleepy, close-knit community was now fractured by fear and uncertainty. Older council members, men and women who had grown up hearing the hushed stories of the town's founding families and the strange rituals associated with the forest, began pushing for secrecy, urging that the matter be handled quietly. They spoke in cryptic phrases, warning that the woods had expectations and that failure to respect them could bring consequences beyond human comprehension. The younger members of the council, who had grown up dismissing old folklore as superstition, were unsettled not only by the intensity of these warnings but by the conviction in the voices of those who delivered them. It was clear that for some in Pine Hollow, what was happening with the Dalton children was more than coincidence. It was the awakening of something the town had once acknowledged in fear and then buried in silence. The council's meetings grew tense and secretive, discussions conducted in low tones behind closed doors, away from the curious eyes of townspeople. References to pacts and agreements surfaced in fragments, suggesting that the community had once entered into obligations with forces unknown, pacts that required adherence or risked the forest's wrath. Though the details were intentionally vague, the implication was unmistakable. Pine Hollow had a debt, a responsibility carried in the bloodlines of certain families, and the Dalton children had become central to the reckoning. The older council members insisted that ignoring the signs would only invite calamity, that the forest, silent, patient, and watchful, would claim what was owed if the town failed to act. They hinted at a cyclical pattern, one that had appeared across generations, where the balance between human settlement and the hidden demands of the woods had to be maintained through rituals long forgotten, carefully concealed, or otherwise obeyed in secret. Tension began to ripple outward, affecting the wider town. Residents noticed the council members speaking in hurried, serious tones with those who had knowledge of the Dalton family history, their conversations punctuated by anxious glances toward the tree line and the clearing where the children had been found. Citizens who had dismissed the events as mere tragedy or coincidence began to feel an undercurrent of dread, a sense that something was being orchestrated beyond their understanding. Even those with no direct connection to the council or the Dalton family sensed a change in the atmosphere, an unspoken warning carried in the crisp night air, in the unnatural hush of the forest, and in the lingering fear reflected in the children's blank, watchful eyes. The message was clear: the town's history was not merely remembered, it demanded compliance, and Pine Hollow would need to confront truths it had long tried to bury before the forest acted on its own terms. The resurfacing of a torn, yellowed diary belonging to the Dalton children's grandmother sent a wave of unease through Pine Hollow that rivaled the dread already gripping the town. The diary had been tucked away in a forgotten drawer of the old Dalton farmhouse, covered in dust and the faint scent of mildew, its pages brittle but legible. When it was discovered, the handwriting immediately drew attention, precise, careful, yet trembling in places, as if the act of recording the words had been both urgent and terrifying. As the pages were read aloud, the contents revealed a family history intertwined with the forest in ways no one had fully understood. The diary spoke of a cycle, a ritual that demanded a sacrifice every 50 years, an offering that the woods themselves required in order to maintain a fragile equilibrium between Pine Hollow and the forces that lurked within the dense trees. The Dalton family, it seemed, had been chosen long before the children were even born, bound by a legacy that had been passed down through generations with warnings whispered in the shadows, never fully explained, but always feared. The diary chronicled previous generations' attempts to appease the forest, the careful observance of rules, and the consequences of even minor deviations from prescribed behaviors. Some entries were filled with dread, recounting the loss of animals, unexplained disappearances, and strange phenomena in the woods that were attributed to the forest's displeasure. Others were more ominous, describing the need for human compliance, and the consequences for those who failed to honor the pact. The words painted a picture of a town that had once known the cost of ignoring its obligations, a town where families had quietly endured tragedies to ensure that the woods remained dormant and the cycle unbroken. The diary's warnings were clear: the forest was patient, but not infinite in its tolerance, and the moment the rules were forgotten or broken, the repercussions could be both immediate and devastating. As the diary's revelations spread among the adults in Pine Hollow, the atmosphere of fear intensified. Townsfolk began piecing together connections between the Dalton children's disappearance, the strange symbol carved into the oak, the whispers in the woods, and now the patterns described in the diary. Each detail seemed to confirm that the events unfolding were not random, not natural, but deliberate, a continuation of a story the town had failed to fully comprehend. The children, innocent in appearance, were now understood as central figures in a legacy they had inherited but never been taught to navigate. The diary offered no comfort, no instructions for safety, only the chilling knowledge that the forest's demands were real, enduring, and inexorably linked to the bloodline of the Daltons. Every night the townspeople felt the weight of the page's revelations pressing on them, a reminder that Pine Hollow's hidden history had not remained buried and that the consequences of ignorance or defiance might already be stirring in the shadows, preparing to claim what it believed was owed. The tension that had gripped Pine Hollow since the Dalton children were found reached a breaking point on the eve of a violent summer storm. Dark clouds rolled across the sky in slow, oppressive waves, and the air grew thick with the scent of rain and something far fouler, an earthy undertone that seemed to rise from the forest itself. For weeks, the children had remained silent, their eyes haunted by sights the adults could not see and their lips sealed against truths too heavy for words. Families huddled in their homes, windows shuttered, listening to the wind whip through the pines, the rhythmic whispers now louder, closer, more insistent. Even the most rational residents could no longer deny that the forest had not released the Daltons unscathed, that something had followed them back, invisible yet palpably present, and it was not finished. As the first heavy drops began to patter against roofs, the youngest Dalton stirred in his bed, sitting upright with a sudden, almost violent urgency. His wide eyes darted toward the corner of the room as though an unseen force had entered and demanded attention. He spoke then, his voice low, tremulous, and breaking the long, impenetrable silence that had dominated the weeks following their rescue. "It woke up again, and it's not done with us," he whispered, words that seemed to hang in the air like smoke, carrying a weight far beyond his years. The adults in the room froze, a collective chill crawling up their spines. No one spoke, no one moved, for even the sound of breathing felt intrusive, as if acknowledging his words might summon the entity he described. The children had been found, yes, but they had not returned alone. The forest, patient and observant, had followed them, its intentions concealed but unmistakably malignant. The whispers outside the house intensified with the storm, rising in volume as the wind tore through the pines, rattling shutters and bending branches. The older Dalton siblings stirred as well, their previously vacant expressions flickering with recognition and fear, their bodies taut and alert. It was as if the words of the youngest had broken an unspoken threshold, awakening something dormant not only in the forest but in the children themselves. Their eyes, once empty and distant, now tracked shadows that flickered unnaturally in the dim light of the house, revealing the presence of something the adults could neither comprehend nor confront. In that moment, Pine Hollow understood with horrifying clarity that the rescue had not ended the story. The children's return had merely signaled the continuation of a cycle, the stirring of an ancient demand that had never been satisfied and could not be ignored. The storm raged outside, a mirror to the storm gathering in the hearts of those who remained awake, and the youngest Dalton's words lingered, an unshakable truth. Whatever had claimed their attention in the woods had returned with them, and the town's reckoning was only just beginning.